anytime you are. Okay.
If an arbitrary date were to be set at which to begin a moral history of the Renaissance, it might well be the 25th of April, 1475. On that day, a young man entered the convent of San Domenico in Bologna. He had fled from his home in Ferrara and was exhausted by the long struggle which had preceded his flight. By what motives he was driven to it, the prior did not inquire. He may have noted in the raw-boned lad with a long sheep-like face certain eloquent features, the full, passionate lips, the powerful nose, the glowing eyes, the thin skin which colored as quickly as a girl's, and drawn his own conclusions. He might have felt under the manly manner an unweaned and almost feminine sensitiveness. But it was not this that moved his sympathy. It was his name. The name was one of considerable consequence. His father was a well-known physician. His grandfather had been an illustrious scholar, a professor of medicine in the University of Ferrara, and court doctor to the Este Dukes. The youth was an acquisition. Accordingly, while another candidate who entered the convent on the same day was promptly rechristened, he was admitted under his secular name of Girolamo Savonarola. That the making of one more monk would prove of consequence to the moral development of the age was the last thing, however, which would have occurred to either the prior or the novice. Yet it was the age which had forced the son of Niccolo Savonarola to enter the cloister. His first act, when the door was drawn and bolted behind him, was to write to his father explaining his motives for renouncing the world. In that hour of supreme decision, he understood them with tragic lucidity, and he expounded them with all the logic he could muster. Honorande pater me, he began, I know that you grieve greatly, particularly since I left you in secret, but I wish you to understand my mind and my purpose, so that you may be comforted and see that I have not acted as childishly as some may believe. In the first place, as a manly man and a despiser of perishable things, I expect you to be a partisan of truth rather than of feeling, as womankind are, and to judge by the dictates of reason whether or not I was bound to follow my purpose and flee the world. He had received a thorough education in logic, and it was a time to think clearly. In primis, the reason that moved me to enter religion is, first, the great misery of the world, the inequities of men, the rapes, adulteries, larcenies, pride, idolatries, and cruel blasphemies which have brought the world so low that there is no longer anyone who does good. Hence, more than once a day I have sung this verse, weeping, Heu fuge crudelas terras, fuge litus avaro. Ah, flee the lands of the unfeeling, the shores of the grasping, flee. And this is why I could not suffer the great malice of the blind peoples of Italy, and the more so as I saw all virtues cast down and all vices raised up. This was the greatest suffering I could have in this world. Answer me then, is it not great virtue in a man to flee the filth and iniquity of this wretched world, and to live like a rational man and not like a beast among swine? He appealed to him. So, my very dear father, you have rather to thank Messer Jesu than to weep. He has given you a son and preserved him right well for 23 years, and not only this, but has deigned to make him his soldier. Oimè, do you not think it is a great grace to have for your son a soldier of Jesus Christ? He argued with him. But to be brief, either you love me or you do not. I know you will not say you do not love me. If then you do, since I have two parts, body and soul, either you love the soul or the body more. You cannot say the body, because you would not love me, loving my vilest part. If then you love the soul, why not seek the good of the soul? And yet I know that the flesh must needs grieve somewhat, but it must be curbed by courage, especially in men like you who are wise and high-hearted. Do you not believe that it has been a great grief to me to leave you? Surely I hope you believe me. Never since the day I was born have I known greater grief or greater pain of mind, forsaking my own blood and going among strangers to sacrifice my body to Jesus Christ and to sell my will into the hands of those I had never known. But then, Remembering that God calls me and that he did not disdain to serve among us worms, I should never have been so bold as to disobey his most sweet and holy call. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my burden upon you. And he concluded, because I know that you will complain of my leaving you secretly and almost fleeing you, I will tell you this. So great was the pain and suffering I felt in my heart when I had to leave you that if I had shown it, I truly believe my heart would have broken. And if I had thought of what I was doing, I could not have done it. So do not wonder that I have told you nothing. I left certain writings which will tell you more of me behind the books on the casement. I beg you, therefore, my dear Father, to put an end to your complaints and to give me no more sorrow and pain than I have. Not that I regret what I have done, for certainly I would not undo it. No, not though I thought to become greater than Caesar, but because I am still flesh like you, and the senses are unruly to reason, so that I must struggle cruelly to keep the demon from leaping on my back and downing me, and the more so when I feel your grief. Soon will they pass, these days when the wound is still fresh, and later I hope that you and I will be consoled in this world by grace, and in the next by glory. No more remains to say, but to beg you as a man to comfort my mother, whom I beseech like you to bless me, and I shall always pray fervently for your souls. Your son, Hieronymus Savonarola. His father laid away the letter in an old book on the fly-leaf of which he noted the dates of his son's birth and death to the world, and by way of obituary he added his laconic comment for posterity. And he left me, Niccolo Savonarola, his father, the enclosed exhortations and consolations for my comfort. He was baffled. All his hopes were invested in that boy. The family looked to him to continue its fortune, and now he had thrown everything away. Why? Because of the great misery of the world, the inequities of men? Niccolo Savonarola was too old to believe in so impersonal a motive, but he searched his memory in vain for a more secret grievance, and as no one understood him but his mother, he consulted her, and they sent a final appeal to the fugitive, but the reply silenced them. The tenderness of the first letter had vanished, and in its place was a note almost harsh. "Ye blind," wrote the novice, "why do you weep yet? Why do you lament? You hamper me, though you should rejoice and exult. What can I say if you grieve yet, save that you are my sworn enemies and foes to virtue? If so, then I say to you, get ye behind me, all ye who work evil." Harsh. He had a right to be. He could make his reason no plainer. The great misery of the world, the inequities of men, all virtues cast down, all vices raised up. What motive could be more personal? In such a world, life was unlivable. It meant intolerable thwarting, intolerable loneliness. Flight was his destiny. He had known it from birth. As long as he could remember, he had always been haunted by the sense of life as something alien and distinct from himself. It had begun, who knows when? Perhaps with his first infant cry, when he emerged from the womb, when he was withdrawn from the long, even sleep of nonentity. And he had always remembered that it was a wonder that anyone ever forgot that first sense of life, which recurred vaguely whenever he came out of sleep and resumed the harness of being, that sense which revived promptly under every disappointment and pain, that sense which he could not explain until he learned from his grandfather that life was an ordeal, and that his soul, his anima transmigratoria, was merely migrating from one eternity to another. His sense of inner detachment had always been the most indelible of realities, and though as he grew up the habit of living spread over it like a thin film and dimmed it, the film was transparent. Surrounded by the affection of his family, immersed in congenial studies, he developed normally. Nevertheless, to the pride of his elders, he displayed an aloofness and poise which surprised them. He felt no need of the company of other boys. They troubled his sense of identity, which, like a reflection in water, wavered at the first questioning touch. And the Christian principles inculcated by his grandfather, which he practiced without effort, for they were his own instincts, were not the habits of other lads of his age. He grew up a solitary. When he was 16, he was sent to the university. For the first time, he mingled with his fellows, and he realized that all that he had been taught, that he had believed, and that he felt was in conflict with the common conduct of men. To be considered a man, you must defile your mouth with the most filthy and brutal and tremendous blasphemies, and set on your neighbor to slay him, and sow seditions and brawls. If you study philosophy and the good arts, you are considered a dreamer. If you live chastely and modestly, a fool. If you are pious, a hypocrite. If you believe in God, an imbecile. If you are charitable, effeminate. To be considered a man, that was the sting. He was approaching manhood, and his male pride was touched to the quick. In the promiscuous school of the world, he was initiated into the truth of nature. From his fellow students, he learned that the only object of life was to live, and its whole meaning the satisfaction of instinct and appetite. And he realized that the one virtue which men honored in practice, whatever they might profess, was the animal virtue of sex, strength and lust. All the rest was sham and illusion. Virtue itself, supreme absurdity, was a question of sex. There was a virtue of the male and a virtue of the female, and the code of Christ was proper only for women. Everything brutal was manly, everything humane, effeminate. And to be considered a man, he must choose between the habits of a world where, as he said bitterly, all vices are lauded and all virtues derided, and his conscience. He did not hesitate. In that crisis, he could open his heart to no one without risking a sneer or a more galling womanish sympathy. But he communed with himself. The record accumulated and became a tract on the contempt of the world. There is no longer one man, no, not one, who desires the good, he concluded. We must learn from women and children, for they are the only ones who still preserve some shade of innocence. The good are oppressed, and the Italian people has become like the Egyptian, which held the people of God in bondage. Then a righteous fury filled his pen, and his impotent revolt invoked omnipotent power. But already famines and floods, sickness and other signs prefigure the afflictions and foretell the wrath of God. Open, open, O Lord, the waters of the Red Sea, and submerge the impious in the waves of your wrath. The shock was too much for him, and the revulsion of feeling which ensued on it undermined his health. He left the university and returned to his home. Alone, in the bosom of his family, he recovered his calm, and time passed, time which changes all things, which could not touch him. Time confirmed his bent and isolated him. Willingly and without qualm, he paid the price of consistency. His very recreations were solitary. If he was not in his study, he was in the nave of the neighborhood church, where the raw rumors of life reached him only as a vague echo, where the din of the street was dim and remote, and the stale sanctified air soothed him, and where he listened in the half-light to the drone of the flies flitting about the fonts in which a tepid water lay stagnating. Or sometimes he went further. He loved the country and spent hours of communion with it in long, lonely rambles along the slow-flowing Po. The wide, flat, treeless landscape had the featureless lineaments of eternity, and in its infinite spaces his being expanded in kindred immensity. Dilating on all sides to an ever-receding horizon, he followed it. The vast, low, alluvial plain, dozing under a moist sun, the murmuring river roaming and grazing, a moving monotone of somnolent contentment. Toward the sea, everything filled his mind with vague intimations of a far country, a heavenly fatherland from which life had made him an exile, and of which at birth he had a dim memory. He brought a book with him and pondered the words of Aquinas. All being is perfect. Devoutly as he believed the angelic doctor, that problem was difficult until he stretched himself on the ground, and then under the hot laden vines, and with the glare and the insinuating scent of the grape, he succumbed and understood. And for an oblivious hour at one with the satisfied earth, he dozed on the page where it was written that all being is perfect. Such solitary proclivities disconcerted his parents. They sent him to court, but after one visit he refused to return. The brilliant court of Borso d'Este wooed him only to wound him. Among the naked athletes wrestling and racing under the eyes of preening women, or in the long formal alleys of Bel Riguardo, loud with the rhythmic loquacity of voluble waters, where groups of lovers nestled, masking the insinuating hands that stole about waists and between knees. He had no place. It was a court of youth, and he was just young enough to know how conservative was youth, how intolerant of deficiency or difference, and he returned to the pleasures of solitude, the long musing soliloquy of a lute, or the self-communion of poetry. About this time, the house next door was rented by a Florentine exile, Roberto Strozzi. He was a member of an illustrious family, and for a time the neighbors met on friendly terms because they had nothing in common. But Strozzi was accompanied by an illegitimate daughter, and a change came over the young Savonarola. He thawed, he expanded, he found his tongue and lost it unaccountably. His heavy face was transfigured, his self-sufficiency had vanished, and he did not miss it. Only a narrow alley lay between them, and in due time he came to the window and proposed marriage. She did not hesitate. Marriage between a Savonarola and a Strozzi? She had a lively sense of her birth and slammed the window. He dismissed the incident and outgrew it. Time passed, and all was the same, and the void within him reopened. I began to reflect how we strive incessantly for unnecessary ends and neglect useful and necessary ones. And considering how continually and violently we rush toward death, I determined to leave all else, to keep the end of man before my eyes, and to prepare for it with all my might. Through God's grace, I began to despise all worldly things. An irresistible longing for my heavenly fatherland burned in my heart, and I resolved to serve my Lord Jesus Christ entirely. Life? What did it hold for him but perpetual thwarting? It was in the nature of things, and there could be no compromise. Heu fuge! The line of Virgil welled up within him, and he repeated it daily, as if he had composed it himself. Heu fuge crudelas terras fuge lictus avarum. His emotion was still literary, and he relieved it in a poem on the ruin of the world. Seeing the world turned upside down and every virtue spent and all customs of fair renown, he brooded insatiably on the theme of all his thoughts. He saw not a single man who blushes for his sins. Happy is he who lives by stealing, and he that feeds on others' blood. Robbing widows and babies is good. Good to hear the poor appealing. Gentle the soul is and feeling that gains the most by force or fraud. He that despises Christ the Lord and thinks on others to trample, him the world will honor. For men like him, the world had no use. The only place for a literal Christian was the cloister. And the craving for spiritual segregation, for freedom and peace, for that slow initiation into death, which was the only solution of life, grew upon him. And what was a normal crisis of adolescence determined his vocation. Yet, who would have had it otherwise? Those green, sick, and ingrowing feelings called him to the company of the prophets. His fear of life, his refusal to compromise with it, were a fundamental human experience. He was the one man who could never harden himself, never sacrifice his integrity to the inexorable reality of nature. And it seemed as if he had been providentially preserved for that purpose. But he was beset by scruples and doubts. And though he had made his decision, it was long before he could unnerve himself to act on it, to forsake his own blood, to go among strangers, to sacrifice his body to Christ and sell his will into the hands of those he had never known. His will, his free will. But what free will could he know in the world? Then filial duty, filial affection gave him pause. His father was in financial difficulties. His mother, with her sense of the intrinsic respectability of money, was worried. His sisters were without dowries. He was their mainstay. The whole future of the family rested on him. But his egoism proclaimed its rights. It hurried him on to an irrevocable step, though because it was irrevocable, he shrank from it with covert dread. His mother divined what was coming, Finding him one day idly strumming his lute, she sat and listened in the room, humming with so many vibrations to the monotonous twanging of a single chord. "Son," she said, "this is a sign of parting." He did not speak, nor did he trust himself to look at her, and she left him with downcast eyes, stubbornly plucking the aching note. The next day was a holiday. The family joined the crowds in the streets, applauding the pageantry, the bonfires, the bells, and the hurly-burly, and when they returned, he was gone. The phantoms of the past lay behind him, and before him, their realities. Freedom and peace. Two things I loved above all, freedom and peace. To have freedom, I would not take a wife, and to find peace, I fled the world and gained the port of religion. But was it really freedom and peace that he wanted? He entered the monastery, a virgin of 23, and life was still strong in him. The lamentations of his parents exasperated and cost him a long struggle to mortify his affections. He fasted and flagellated himself strenuously until at last his superiors were forced to moderate his austerities. But nothing could check him. Some instinct warned him, perhaps, that his genius was in his power of feeling, and he lavished it incessantly on the worship of his Redeemer. He began to have visions, to fall into trances, and to pass through the strain, the revelation, and the ineffable exhaustion of mystic fusions. By the end of his novitiate, he had already acquired a reputation for sanctity. 2 monks from Vallombrosa, visiting the monastery, wished to pay their respects to the prodigy. They were somewhat disconcerted by their reception. The costly quality of their cloth caught his eye. They were forced to explain that it was not a luxury. The better the cloth, the more durable it was. It really represented an economy. He smiled, an innocent smile. "Oh, what a pity," he sighed. "What a pity that San Benedetto and San Giovanni Gualberto did not know this secret. Who knows, perhaps they too would have worn such cloth." The retort had a mild success at the refectory table, where it was repeated by the monks with smiles that showed their gums. It was significant that he had to be urged, induced, and even forced to pursue the studies for which by training and ability he was eminently fitted. He had not entered religion, he said, to exchange the Aristotle of the world for the Aristotle of the cloister. He submitted as a matter of discipline, but everything that reminded him of the past, that humored his inclinations, and that tempted him to relax, he dreaded. In time, however, his natural aptitudes told. He studied with zeal and an easy conscience, and so congenial an activity won him freedom from the flesh and a measure of peace. He long remembered the 4 years he spent in the convent school as the happiest in his life. Freedom and peace, he had found them. And if they were all he desired, his life might well have ended there. There was no reason why, like unnumbered others before and since who have sought the cloister, he could not sink into anonymity and oblivion. Why, that living death which he desired as the nearest approximation to actual extinction, amid the tolling of bells, the telling of beads, the small tasks, the meditative lethargy of a studious and neutral routine, why should he have not passed away unknown? Steadfastly keeping his eyes on the end of man, why should he have not subsided into a death which had become familiar and easy, domestic and tame, and almost unreal? But it would have been too easy. A new phase of life was beginning, and it was woven of the same motives as the old. In the cloister he was alone, as in the world. His ecstatic piety set him apart. He soon discovered that the convent was not what he had conceived it to be. It was not very different from the world, a sequestered microcosm, a small, stagnant replica of the real world without. It was what its inmates made it, and it was all things to all men. A school for the studious, a haven for the heartsick, an asylum for the indigent, a nursery for the ambitious, all things, alas, but a congregation of mystic spirits akin to his own. The truth dawned on him slowly. The complacent mediocrity of his companions dismayed him. But the more he advanced in his chosen vocation, the higher he looked for inspiration, the grimmer the prospect became. The higher ranks of the hierarchy were filled with political priests and successful careerists, and it was inevitable that it should be so. The church was a political institution, but it was also a spiritual one, and the confusion of its functions was profoundly demoralizing. The lives of the great ecclesiastics were indistinguishable from those of the laity. What was tolerable in a secular state was scandalous in a spiritual one, and the corruption of Rome, its simony, nepotism, and luxury, flowing down from the head through the members, infected the whole body. The entire edifice was rotten with a ramifying network of decay. He saw the issue with the absolute innocence, the absolute insight of innocent youth, and it affected him like a personal injury. The worldliness of the church undermined the moral authority of a calling created to curb the brutality of the world. It violated his sanctuary, it defeated his flight. In the convent he found the world once more, and he could flee no further. But who in the convent felt as he did? With the echo of each new scandal in Rome, his indignation rose. Yet who was he to protest? And in whom could he confide? He stifled his feelings, and when they grew too urgent, he took up his pen. Within a year of his admission to the convent, he composed a sequel to The Ruin of the World and lamented the ruin of the church. Where are the saints and doctors of old? Where the ancient candor, charity, and doctrine? He appeals to the bride of Christ, who takes him by the hand, leads him to a hovel, and replies, "When I beheld proud ambition penetrate into Rome and contaminate all things, then I retired to this place where I spend my life in mourning." He notes the bruises on her body and urges her to name her oppressor, to which she responds with a sigh. "A false, proud whore, the whore of Babylon. And he takes flame, O God, lady, that I might be the one to rend those mighty wings." But the impulse is checked. Then she replied, "It may not be, no tongue of man may chide, nor battle in my behalf. Mark my request, weep and be silent, this seems to me best." But he heaved under the heavy truth as under an incubus. On the walls, the figure of St. Dominic with his finger on his lips enjoined silence and submission as the first rule of the order. But to nurse such thoughts and smother them was to succumb to a worse sin, the sin of acedia, that essentially monastic sin of melancholy and sloth, to which a virtuous nature was peculiarly prone. He could not be passive. In the convent he was trapped. He had fled the world only to find himself in an impasse. He was balked, and the logic of life forced him to turn, to advance, to grapple with the adversary. There was no eluding the world. It had followed him into his retreat. It had found him out. He could only fight it. It was both a moral necessity and a professional duty. The order of St. Dominic was an order of militant preachers. Over the doorway, the Dominicani confronted the world, the hounds of the Lord with the torch in their teeth. They were missionaries. Whatever the figure of the founder might enjoin within, silence, submission, discipline, study, these were but training toward their ultimate role. Sanctity was sterile. Virtue was not an end in itself, but an active principle for the diffusion of good. The coincidence of passion and duty inspired him, and an ardor of activity awoke in him as consuming as had once been his craving for distinction. Freedom and peace, had he a right to them? They were self-indulgence, evasion. The turning point had come. Everything seemed to justify the highest expectations of his success as a preacher. He had the temperament, the learning, and a power of feeling which amounted to genius if he could communicate it. But his first efforts were unsuccessful. The public of Bologna, accustomed to the polished oratory of a university town, was critical. His delivery was feeble, he lacked self-confidence, he was lame. But his superiors encouraged him. These were minor defects, symptoms of inexperience, a mere matter of art. And art could be acquired. He studied with a professor in the university, but after a few lessons he convinced himself that eloquence could not be acquired by rote. Though his tutor assured him that if he would add oratory to philosophy and theology, he would win immortal encomiums, he forsook the study of Priscian and returned to his Bible. The business of developing his still small voice of conscience into a professional organ filled him with distaste. It smacked of insincerity, and the fact that an element of calculation was essential to conviction in art disgusted him. His deliberate effects, his studied tones, his rhetorical gestures confused him. He felt their hollowness too keenly to make them convincing to others. He began to lose heart, and his superiors, with the tact of experience, transferred him to the instruction of the novices. At the end of his 6th year, he was sent to Ferrara to begin his pastoral duties. A cutting comment sank in his memory. The brothers, it was said, must be in great need of workers. He took it to heart. It was as if they had said, if they had set so worthless a man as you to so great a task, they must indeed be hard-pressed for workers. It was a painful homecoming, and to account for his failure as a profession, in a profession for which he had sacrificed everything, he was forced to resort to the old proverb, nemo propheta, no man is a prophet in his own country. His parents, however, had to account to the neighbors, and when the clouds of war threatened Ferrara and forced the Dominican convent to dispense with its superfluous members, he was relieved to be transferred to Florence. There at least he would be among strangers. An incident which occurred on the way lent him some fleeting comfort. Traveling up the Po, he found himself among a boatload of soldiers whose gaming and blasphemies stung him into passionate protest. The words poured from him, and he was amazed at his eloquence, and so were the soldiers, who gathered about him begging his forgiveness and his blessing. It was his first sensation of success, but it was as fugitive as the banks slipping by. He had spoken at white heat, but that compelling passion could not be commanded or calculated or counterfeited or repeated. It was an impulse, and between the unpremeditated eloquence of a man-to-man argument and the studied flow of soul of the pulpit, there was a gap which he could not cross and which shut him out from the promised land. The little elevation of the pulpit, by so narrow a margin was he missing his mission. Between him and his goal lay the contemptible impediment of art. The slow-flowing Po slipped by, receding toward the sea, and the powerful wake of waters seemed to solicit the traveler, wooing him to drift back on the oblivious current. But the boat pushed on upstream against the current, bearing him slowly toward new pastures. Toward the promised land? In Florence, his failure was yet more dismal. He preached in San Lorenzo to a congregation which had dwindled by the end of Lent to 25 souls. Such friends as he found were his first critic. Father, he was told, there is no denying that your doctrine is true, useful, and necessary, but your manner of presenting it is lacking in grace, especially as we have the example of Fra Mariano before our eyes. Fra Mariano! He was prepared for that comparison with the reigning virtuoso of the Florentine pulpits. The archetype of the popular preacher, his name was on every tongue. The young monk from the provinces was unimpressed. This florid speech and elegance must yield, he insisted, to the simplicity of sound doctrine. But the results belied his conviction. The simplicity of sound doctrine, as he preached it, emptied the churches. The art of Fra Mariano filled them. Nor was that all. Mariano was no hypocrite, no caterer to frivolous taste. His doctrine was sound, his character unimpeachable. He practiced the strictest austerity in his private life, but he had the grace to conceal it. With grace, everything could be accomplished in Florence. His amenity had won him the ear of Lorenzo de' Medici and built him a church of his own, nor did his conquests end there. The humanists, who followed Lorenzo and set the intellectual fashions of Florence, were equally charmed. Even the skeptical Poliziano succumbed. Following the crowd, incredulous but curious, he visited one of his performances, and coming, as he admitted, to scoff, he remained, if not to pray, at least to applaud. To that delightful experience, he devoted a glowing letter which was making the rounds of his friends and those of Fra Mariano. I came very suspicious of, and ill-disposed to, his great fame. Hardly had I entered the church, however, when his habits, his face, and his figure changed my mind, and I immediately expected something impressive and grand. More than once, I confess, he seemed to me to greater in the pulpit, to more than human proportions. He speaks, I am all ears. I drink in his mellow voice, his apt words, his noble sentences. I discern the accents, I recognize the periods. I am dominated by the harmonious cadences. There is nothing confused, tame, or dull. He unfolds the argument, and I am convinced. Introduces an apposite anecdote, and I am interested. Modulates his voice, and I am charmed. Is jocular, and I smile. Presses me with serious truths, I yield to their force. Appeals to the passions, and I weep. Lifts his voice in wrath, and I tremble and wish myself away. Even more persuasive was his personal character. There was nothing morose in his manner or disagreeably austere. He does not disdain the charms of poetry and polite letters. He neither repels his hearers by undue severity nor misleads them by overlenience. So many preachers fancy themselves the masters of life and death and abuse their powers and cavil at everything and weary us with perpetual admonitions. Mariano is moderation itself. A stern censor in the pulpit, he no sooner leaves it than he becomes civil and genial. In short, the ideal of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And such was the Florentine taste. A graceful austerity, an elegant asceticism, a liberal religion of enlightened common sense, and it was impressed on the newcomer that he must study that sophisticated public if he hoped to appeal to it. But what could such advice mean to the artless young preacher from the provinces? It was easy to be graceful when one did not feel deeply, and to be accommodating when nothing was at stake. In the plausible manner of Fra Mariano, he detected, without being able to expose, the lurking contamination of the world. It was not his business to flatter, it was his duty to cure. And yet Fra Mariano, it was undeniable, was winning souls in the very citadel of religious indifference among the advanced thinkers of the day, and accomplishing by grace what, for the lack of it, he was forced to forego. The fact was irrefutable, and he determined to abandon the pulpit. The promised land lay before him. Ave atque vale. What else could he do? He was born to be baffled by the world, but the prospect of a long future of useless mediocrity was too bleak. In the extremity of his discouragement, he recoiled from it. The struggle had only begun, and already he was shirking it. Had he a right to fail? Was his whole future to be defeated by what? Wherever he turned, it haunted him. Everywhere in the subtle city, even in the cloisters of San Marco, in the conventual gardens crowded with antique sculpture, in the cells and corridors, people with the bland visions of Fra Angelico. He was surrounded and troubled by the insidious challenge of art. Recognizing his inexperience, his superiors sent him occasionally to neighboring towns or to the little church of the Murate in a popular quarter where his hearers were uncritical. In San Marco, meanwhile, he was assigned to the instruction of the novices. He was at ease in the intimacy of the classroom, and his familiar homilies impressed his pupils. Often in the morning he would appear with tears in his eyes and expound the scriptures with such a heartfelt fervor that he seemed, as one said, not so much to have studied as meditated them. He had found his right field, and apparently the limit of his development: to teach, to pass on the torch, to rear spiritual athletes for the arena he would never enter. Among his pupils was a young monk in whom he took a peculiar interest. Fra Silvestro Maruffi had been afflicted since childhood with somnambulism, and his malady, which took strange forms, gave him a privileged position in the convent. His psyche was as mischievous as a monkey. He filled the dormitories with simian disasters. Whenever the brothers woke to find their faces smeared with sawdust from the spittoons, or the prior missed his robes and traced them through the corridors, they knew what spirit had been walking. His malady, which he imputed to overstudy, was regarded with sympathy, for he invariably awoke with sighs and groans and cries of "Jesus!" With time and bloodletting, it was hoped that he would improve. In one respect, he was thoroughly normal. He was an inveterate gossip, and in his humble way, he was an agent of the true and the good. As for his pranks, they were a source of innocent merriment and enlivened the monotony of convent life. Savonarola himself treated him with indulgence. One day, while he held his class in the garden, the sleepwalker slipped off into the arbor, where he seized a stick and began to beat down the grapes. A friar followed and was furiously thwacked on the head. But who minded? The friar retreated, Fra Silvestro ate his fill, and as Savonarola said, the grapes being good did him no harm, and he awoke. Soon his interest in this pupil grew. The moonstruck monk knew that he was a privileged character. His infirmity gave him a sickly sense of self-importance, and he throve on it. In time, he began to have visions of an edifying nature. He was even tempted to regard them as revelations. But Savonarola promptly scouted such presumptuous notions, and the youth obeyed and resisted temptation. He was perfectly sensible as soon as he secured a little attention, but he could not bear to be forgotten. In time, however, Savonarola himself was visited with visions. His vigils, his fast, his mortifications were incessant. His spirits became clairvoyant, and one day in a nunnery he heard a voice bidding him go forth and announce the coming scourge of God on a degenerate church. Fra Silvestro was alarmed. If his own visions were delusions, and he had resisted the temptation to believe them, he saw no reason why his master should be less sensible. Savonarola agreed, but gradually began to conceive the possibility that the revelations of his pupil might be authentic. Fra Silvestro was uncertain and jealous. Visions had hitherto been his monopoly. Mollified, skeptical, tempted, he believed and doubted, doubted and believed with mercurial volatility, and he exerted a peculiar power of suggestion on his master. Savonarola now found, whenever he was solicited by the unseen, the sleepwalker at his elbow, in an attitude of vigilant suspicion. At one moment Fra Silvestro steadied him with his sanity, at another he seduced him with subconscious suggestion. He was alternately angel and ape, and he troubled his conscience with simian disasters. Especially, however, Savonarola was removed from the ambiguous influence of his eventually, however, Savonarola was removed from the ambiguous influence of his pupil. Preaching in San Gimignano in 1486, he startled his hearers by predicting that the church would be scourged and regenerated in the near future. The prophecy created a great impression, but he was careful to explain on his return to Florence that it was founded on natural reason and the interpretation of scriptural texts. Then he was sent to Lombardy, where for the next 4 years he lived the life of an itinerant preacher. He passed from town to town, footloose, free, unfettered, but not unmarked. Among the simple, wholesome peace of the people of the North, who spoke his own tongue, he began to make headway. He developed his own manner, a manner familiar and colloquial, strenuous and unstudied. He spoke to his congregations as he spoke to his novices, from the heart, with the intimacy of a man-to-man argument. He carried on, he whose life had been a monologue, a searching conversation with himself in the pulpit. And when these appeals did not suffice, he went further. Flagellating himself regularly, his visions recurred. He accepted them with caution, but at last in Brescia, after a trance of 5 hours, he had a revelation whose reality he could no longer doubt, and he preached a sermon in which, invoking the 24 elders of the Apocalypse and foretelling the destruction of Brescia and the doom of Italy, he electrified and overpowered his hearers. Soaring on the wings of prophecy, his eloquence was supernal and irresistible. His fame spread in the land. His self-confidence grew, yet he knew in what field he bore his best fruit. It was not in Florence, nor was it in Ferrara. When his mother urged him to return, "I have renounced this world and devoted myself to working in the vineyard of the Lord in various cities," he replied, "to save not only my own soul, but those of others as well. If the Lord has given me a talent, I must use it as he pleases, and since he has chosen me for this holy office, be content that I exercise it outside my own country, for here I bear far better fruit than in Ferrara. There it would befall me as it befell Christ when his countrymen said, 'Is not this man a smith and the son of a smith?' But outside my own country this is not said to me. Nay, when I propose to depart, men and women weep and cherish my words. I meant to write only a few lines, but love has made my pen run on, and I have opened my heart to you more than I thought to do. Know then that I am more than ever resolved to expose my soul, my body, and all the learning God has given me for love of him and the salvation of my neighbor. And since I cannot do this at home, I shall do it elsewhere. Exhort everyone to the good life. Today I live for Genoa. Today I leave for Genoa." But that was not to be. He could not flicker out as a provincial preacher. In the fullness of time, another call came. 7 years before, speaking on the corruption of the clergy at a Dominican chapter, he had attracted the attention of an illustrious layman, Pico della Mirandola. Pico was a dilettante, and he was profoundly moved by such burning conviction. It was the one quality he lacked. He had every other charm: youth, beauty, wealth, noble birth, a prodigious learning. He was a master of the omnium scibile, but he knew nothing with certitude. He envied the unknown monk who knew what he knew so thoroughly. He coveted his conviction even about such a commonplace as the corruption of the clergy. A fortnight he sang the praises of his discovery throughout Florence, then he forgot. His multifarious interests and activities claimed him, but in the meanwhile they had grown and almost ruined him. He conceived the idea of a universal intellectual congress in Florence and challenged the whole learned world to meet him in debate on any or all of 900 propositions embracing the entire field of human knowledge. Then Rome intervened. Certain of his theological problems were declared unorthodox. Pico protested, and the scandal was only averted by the good offices of Lorenzo de' Medici. Disgusted by the censorship of free thought, and more so by its hypocrisy, for the doctrinal vigor of Rome was indecent in view of the moral laxity that prevailed there, Pico no longer regarded the corruption of the clergy indifferently. The normal dubiety of his eye glowed with conviction, and memory opened to give up a ghost. He recalled the friar and hurried to San Marco. To his amazement, he found that Savonarola had left Florence 4 years before. Pico hurried to Lorenzo de' Medici and begged his recall. Lorenzo listened. He knew nothing of the man, but the indignant dilettante was his dear friend, and San Marco was his own convent founded by his grandfather. "With goodwill and good ink, I am always ready to serve you," he said, and directed his secretary to write to the Lombard Dominicans. The call had come. Savonarola was ready for it. He had matured, he was in full command of his powers, and he set forth to face the public of Fra Mariano once more. On the way, weak with mortification and fasting, he succumbed to sunstroke. But he was assisted by a passing Samaritan, and at the gates of Florence he was supported by a voice, an inner voice diffused through the immensity of the heavens, bidding him advance and remember to do what God bids you to do. He abandoned himself to it. His footsteps were led. In San Marco, he resumed his instruction of the novices, but new influences were at work. His lessons attracted a growing circle of laymen. The class moved into the garden, but the garden was too small to accommodate it, and after several weeks he was urged to ascend the pulpit. The invitation had come unsought. He had not lifted a finger to prompt it. It was a manifest summons. He spent the night in prayer, and in the morning he announced with certitude that he would preach not only on the following Sunday, but for 8 years thereafter. On August 1st, 1489, An enormous congregation assembled in the church of San Marco. The friars filled the choir and clung to the gratings to follow his ordeal. His professional life was at stake. It was his last chance in Florence. He was too old for another. All his past failures were congregated in that crowd which converted the church into a spiritual arena. And already in the sacristy he scented it waiting. It gripped him as he mounted the pulpit, step by step, toward his struggle. On all sides he was surrounded by the enemy of a lifetime, by a dense, unfeeling mass of humanity, challenging him to master and move it. There could be no question of courting it, and the only alternative was to shock and violate, to rouse, to startle, and contradict it. He braced himself and began. With the voice of the whirlwind, he launched his prediction of the imminent scourging of the church, and without waiting for its proven effect, plunged into a furious improvisation that swept everything before it, attacking in rapid succession all the themes that kindled his indignation and his eloquence: the corruption of the clergy, the demoralization of the laity, the decay of the faith. The pent-up energies of years rose. The words poured from him like a rhetorical hemorrhage. Anguish galvanized all his powers, and in a rush of invective, expostulation, threats, and appeals, he pressed and kneaded the multitude until the sluggish mass began to quicken and stir. Those who remembered him from San Lorenzo listened in amazement to a new man, whose voice was thrilling, whose gestures were sweeping, and who excited and troubled them with a new sensation. Under the rhetorical controversy, the ostensible subjects, and the impersonal words rose an inarticulate appeal which tugged at their nerves. The gaunt figure in the pulpit was like a castaway, crying, gesticulating for recognition and response, baring his heart, stripping his soul, spending his last breath to rejoin humanity, and when he had reached it, wrestling, appealing, forcing it to feel with him, and the multitude responded with a deepening silence, then with a tide of exclamations and sighs, and at last with a murmuring ovation. He had sprung the secret of the revivalist. As he descended, the public of Fra Mariano, rudely startled out of its habits, but excited by his sensational novelty and still teeming with his hypnotic power, crowded about him. Sunday struck in his heart, his first day of rest in 38 laborious years. An admiring throng followed him into the convent, and amid those flushed and enthusiastic faces, he was no longer haunted by the insidious challenge of art. Let's see, that may be enough for today.
All right. You got to go outside. That's the best part. Getting into the art side.
The art side.
Well,
Yeah.
the challenge, the ultimate challenge.
The insidious challenge of art.